Warning: the video you are about to watch may contain language and scenarios of a highly adult nature and is therefore not intended for children under the age of 18. Viewer discretion is advised. Hey, what is up? This is Couch Potato Mike back in the book club for part 3 of Gabriel's Inferno by Sylvain Reynard. Sorry that I missed last week, guys, but life gets in the way sometimes. But I've got to deal with you. If I can get 50 likes on this video, I will guarantee, let me fix the camera here, that I will start putting out two videos of this per week. I just need 50 likes on this video, and you start getting 2 a week. Easy enough. And if you're not subscribed, please do so. So, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and jump right into this. Part 3 of Gabriel's Inferno by Sylvain Reynard, which starts on Chapter 6. On Friday, Julia received an official form in her mailbox indicating that Professor Emerson had agreed to be her thesis supervisor. She was staring at the form in amazement, wondering why he had reversed his decision when Paul came up behind her. "Ready to go?" She greeted him with a smile as she placed the form in her crudely mended knapsack. They exited the building and began walking down Bloor Street to the nearest Starbucks, which was only about a half a block away. "I want to ask you about your meeting with Emerson, but before I do, there's something I need to tell you." Paul sounded serious. Julia looked over at him with an expression that resembled anxiety. "Don't be scared, Rabbit. It's not going to hurt." He patted her arm. Paul's heart was almost as big as he was, and so he was very sensitive to the pain of others. "I know about what happened with our note." Julia closed her eyes and cursed. "Paul, I'm so sorry about that. I was going to tell you that I screwed up and wrote on your note, but I didn't get a chance. I didn't tell him it was your handwriting." Paul pressed his hand against her upper arm to stop her. "I know that. I told him." She looked up at him in astonishment. "Why would you do that?" As he probed the depths of Rabbit's large brown eyes, he knew without doubt that he would do anything to keep someone from hurting her, even if it meant his academic career. Even if it meant dragging Emerson out behind the Department of Italian Studies and giving him the serious ass-kicking that he and his pretentious posterior so richly deserved. "Mrs. Jenkins told me Emerson was hauling you in, and I figured he was going to chew you out. I found a copy of our note in a pile of photocopying he left for me." He shrugged. "Occupational hazard of being a research assistant to a total dick." Paul tugged Julia slightly to persuade her to keep walking, but waited to continue their conversation until he had purchased her a very large sugar-free vanilla latte. Once she had settled in a purple velvet armchair, like a cat, and he had satisfied himself that she was both warm and comfortable, he turned to her with a sympathetic expression. "I know it was an accident. You were so shaken up after his first seminar. I should have walked you to his office myself. Honestly, Julia, I've never seen him act the way he did that day. He can be kind of uppity and touchy about things, but he's never been so aggressive with a female student before. It was painful to watch." Julia sipped her coffee and waited for him to continue. "So, when I found a copy of our note with the junk that he left for me, I knew he was going to rake you over the coals. I found out what time your appointment was and scheduled a meeting with him before it. Then I confessed that I'd written the note. I even lied and tried to say I'd forged your signature as a joke, but he didn't buy it." "You did all that for me?" Paul smiled and casually flexed his substantial arms. "I was trying to be a human shield. I thought if he shouted at me and got it out of his system, he'd have nothing left for you." He studied her expression thoughtfully. "But it didn't work, did it?" She looked at him in gratitude. "No one has ever done something like that for me before. I really owe you one." "Don't mention it. I only wish he'd taken his anger out on me. What did he say to you?" She focused all of her attention on her coffee and acted as if she hadn't heard the question. "That bad, huh?" Paul rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Well, it must have blown over because he was polite to you in his last seminar." Julia snickered. "Sure. But he wouldn't let me answer any questions. Even when I put my hand up, he was too busy letting Krista Peterson do all the talking. Paul observed her sudden flash of indignation with amusement. Don't worry about her. She's in for some trouble with Emerson over her dissertation proposal. He doesn't like the direction she's taking, he told me. That's terrible. Does she know? He shrugged. She should be able to figure it out, but who knows? She's so focused on seducing him that she's letting her work slide. It's embarrassing. Julia noted all of this and tucked it into her memory for future reference. She sat back in her chair, relaxed, and enjoyed the rest of her afternoon with Paul, who was charming and thoughtful and made her glad she was in Toronto. At 5 o'clock her stomach rumbled and she clutched at it awkwardly. Paul laughed and smiled in order to ease her embarrassment. She was so cute about everything, including the way her stomach growled. Do you like Thai food? I do. There was a great place in Philadelphia I used to go to with... She caught herself before she said his name out loud. That restaurant had been the place she'd always gone with him. She silently wondered if they were going there now, eating at her table, laughing at the menu, mocking her. Paul cleared his throat to gently bring her back to him. Sorry. She ducked her head and rummaged in her knapsack for nothing in particular. There's a great Thai place down the street. It's a few blocks away, so it would be a bit of a walk, but the food is really good. If you don't have any plans, let me take you to dinner. His nervousness was telegraphed only in the show, only in the slow and subtle tapping of his right foot, which Julia detected out of the corner of her eye, just visible over the edge of the coffee table. She looked up into his warm, dark eyes and thought briefly about how kindness was worth so much more in the world than passion, and she said yes before she could even contemplate saying no. He smiled as if her acceptance gave him more than a secret delight, and picked up her knapsack, effortlessly swinging it over his shoulder. This is too heavy a burden for you, he said, gazing into her eyes, choosing every word carefully. Let me carry it for a while. Julia smiled at her toes and followed him outside. Professor Emerson was walking home from work. It was a short walk, although on inclement days and days on which he had an evening engagement, he drove. While he traveled, he thought about the lecture that he was going to deliver at the university on lust in Dante. Lust was a sin that he found himself thinking of often and with much enjoyment. In fact, the thought of lust and its myriad satisfactions was so tantalizing, Professor Emerson found himself pulling his trench coat closed so the slightly spectacular sight of the front of his trousers would not attract untoward attention. That's when he saw her. He stopped, staring across the street at the attractive brunette. Calamity Julianne. Except she was not alone. Paul was holding her abomination of a book bag and walking with her. They were chatting easily and laughing and strolling dangerously close to one another. Carrying her books now, are we? How very adolescent of you, Paul. Professor Emerson watched as the couple's hands brushed against each other, drawing a small but warm smile from Miss Mitchell. A growl rumbled low in Emerson's throat and his lips curled back from his teeth. What the hell was that? He thought. Professor Emerson took a moment to collect himself, and as he leaned against the window of the Louis Vuitton boutique, he tried to figure out what the hell had just happened. He was a rational agent. He wore clothes to cover his nakedness, he drove a car, and he ate with a knife and fork and a linen napkin. He was gainfully employed in a job that required intellectual ability and acuity. He controlled his sexual urges through various civilized means and would never take a woman against her will. Nevertheless, as he stared at Miss Mitchell and Paul, he realized that he was an animal, something primitive, something feral, and something made him want to go over there and rip Paul's hands from his body and carry Miss Mitchell off, to kiss her senseless, move his lips to her neck and claim her. What the fuck? The thought scared the living hell out of the professor. In addition to being an ass and a pompous prick, he was a knuckle-dragging, potentially mouth-breathing Neanderthal who felt something proprietary ownership over a younger woman he barely knew and who hated him. Not to mention the fact that she was his student. He needed to go home, lie down, and breathe until he calmed the fuck down. Then he was going to need something else. Something stronger to calm his urges. As Professor Emerson continued his journey home, dragging himself painfully away from the sight of the two young people together, he pulled out his iPhone and quickly pressed a few buttons. A woman answered on the third ring. Hello? Hello, it's me. Can I see you tonight? The following Wednesday, Julia was walking out of the apartment building after Emerson's seminar when she heard a familiar voice call to her. Julia? Julia Mitchell, is that you? She whipped around and was drawn into a hug that was so tight she thought she'd choke. Rachel, she managed as she fought for air. The thin, blonde-haired girl squealed loudly and hugged Julia again. I've missed you. I can't believe it's been so long. What are you doing here? Rachel, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for everything, and for your mom and everything. Two friends were quiet in their shared sorrow and held one another for a long time. I'm sorry I missed the funeral. How's your dad? Julie asked, wiping away tears. He's lost without her. We all are. He's on a leave of absence from Susquehanna right now, trying to sort some things out. I'm on leave too, but I had to get away. Why didn't you tell me you were here? Rachel reproached her tearfully. Julia's eyes shifted uncomfortably from her friend to Professor Emerson, who had just exited the building and was gaping at her like a codfish. I wasn't sure I'd be staying. The first couple of weeks have been really, rough. Rachel, who by all accounts was very intelligent, noticed the strange and somewhat conflicted energy radiating between her adopted brother and her friend, but for the moment she overlooked it. I was just telling Gabriel that I'm going to cook for him tonight. Come home with us. Julia's eyes grew wide and round, and she looked very mildly panicked. Gabriel cleared his throat. Ah, Rachel. I'm sure Miss Mitchell is busy and has other plans. Julia caught his look, pregnant with meaning, and began to nod obediently. Rachel whirled around. Miss Mitchell? She was my best friend in high school, and we've been friends ever since. Didn't you know that? Rachel searched her brother's eyes and saw nothing, not even a glimmer of recognition. I forgot that the two of you never met. Regardless, your attitude is a bit much. Do me a favor and lose the pole from your keister. She whirled back around to see Julia swallowing her tongue, or at least that's what it looked like she was doing, as she almost turned blue and began to cough. We should meet for lunch instead. I'm sure your brother wants you all to himself. Julia forced a smile, conscious of the fact that Gabriel was staring daggers at her over his sister's head. Rachel narrowed her eyes. He's Gabriel, Julia. What's wrong with you two? She's my student. There are rules. Gabriel's tone began to grow increasingly cool and unfriendly. She's my friend, Gabriel, and I say screw the rules. Rachel looked between her brother and her friend and saw Julia gazing down at her shoes and Gabriel scowling at the both of them. Will someone please tell me what's going on? When neither Julia nor Gabriel replied, Rachel crossed her arms in front of her chest and narrowed her eyes. She considered briefly Julia's remark about the first weeks of university being rough and came to one swift conclusion. Gabriel Owen Emerson, have you been an ass to Julia? Julia smothered a laugh and Gabriel frowned. Despite their collective silence, either reaction would have been enough to tell Rachel that her suspicion was correct. Well, I don't have time for this nonsense. You two will just have to kiss and make up. I'm only here for a week, and I expect to spend lots of time with both of you. Rachel grabbed each of them by the arm and dragged them toward the Jaguar. Rachel Clark was nothing like her adopted brother. She was an assistant to the press secretary of the mayor of Philadelphia, which sounded important, but really wasn't. In fact, the majority of her days were spent either scouring local newspapers for any mention of the mayor, or photocopying press releases. On especially auspicious days, she was permitted to update the mayor's blog. In appearance, Rachel was fine-featured and willowy, with straight, long hair, freckles, and gray eyes. She was also very outgoing, which sometimes exasperated her much older, introverted brother. Gabriel kept his lips firmly pressed together during the drive to his condo as the two women chatted in the back seat like a couple of high school girls, giggling and reminiscing. He didn't relish spending an evening with the both of them, but his sister was suffering at the moment, and he wasn't about to do anything to add to her suffering. Soon the two-thirds happy trio was riding the elevator in the Manulife building, an impressive luxury high-rise on Bloor Street. As they exited the elevator on the top floor, Julia noticed that there were only four doors opening onto the hallway. Wow, these apartments must be huge. Once Julia entered the condo and followed Gabriel through the small foyer into the central and open-concept living space, she realized why his sensibilities had been so offended by her studio. His spacious apartment boasted floor-to-ceiling windows, which were hung with dramatic ice-blue silk curtains, facing south to the CN Tower and over Lake Ontario. The floors were rich, dark hardwood, with Persian rugs adorning them, and the walls were light taupe. His living room furniture looked as if it had been chosen from the Restoration Hardware, and ranged from a large chocolate brown leather sofa with nailhead detailing, to two matching leather club chairs, to a red velvet wingback chair that was angled next to the fireplace. Julia looked at the lovely red chair and its matching ottoman with more than a little envy. It would be the perfect place to sit on a rainy day while sipping a cup of tea and reading a favorite book. Not that she would ever have that opportunity. The fireplace had a gas insert, and Gabriel had suspended a flat plasma screen television over the mantel as if it were a painting. Various pieces of art, oil paintings and sculpture, adorned the walls and some of the furniture. He had museum-quality pieces of Roman glass and Greek pottery interspersed with reproductions of famous sculptures, including the Venus de Milo and Bernini's Apollo and Daphne. In fact, thought Julia, he had entirely too many sculptures, all of them female nudes. But there were no personal photographs. Julia considered it a good deal more than strange that there were black and white pictures of Paris, Rome, London, Florence, Venice, and Oxford, but no photos of the Clarks, not even of Grace. In the next room, near the large, formal dining table, stood an ebony sideboard. Julia took in its richness and expanse appreciatively. It was bare except for a large crystal vase and an ornate silver tray that held various decanters containing amber-colored liquids, an ice chest, and old-fashioned crystal glasses. Silver ice tongs completed the vignette, angled across a stack of small, square white linen napkins with the initials G.O.E. embroidered on them. Julia giggled to herself when she envisioned what those napkins would look like if Gabriel's last name had been, say, Davidson. In short, Professor Emerson's apartment was aesthetically pleasing, tastefully decorated, scrupulously clean, intentionally masculine, and very, very cold. Julia wondered briefly if he ever brought a woman home to this frigid place. Then she tried very hard not to imagine what he would do to them when he brought them here. Perhaps he had a room for such purposes, so that they wouldn't soil his precious things. She ran a hand across the cold, black granite countertop in the kitchen and shivered. Rachel immediately preheated the oven and washed her hands. "Gabriel, why don't you give Julia the grand tour while I start dinner?" Julia clutched her knapsack to her chest, unwilling to put so offensive an item on his furniture. Gabriel took it out of her hands and placed it on the floor under a small table. She smiled at him in appreciation, and he found himself smiling back at her. He didn't want to give Miss Mitchell a tour of his condo, and he certainly wasn't about to show her his bedroom and the black and white photos that adorned those walls. But with Rachel there to remind him of his obligation as a reluctantly gracious host, he didn't see a way out of giving her a tour of the guest rooms. So that is how he came to be standing in his study, which had been a third bedroom, but which he had converted into a comfortable working library by installing darkwood bookshelves from floor to ceiling. Julia gaped at all the books, titles new and rare and mostly hardcovered in Italian, Latin, French, English, and German. The room, like the rest of his condo, was intentionally masculine. The same ice blue curtains, the same dark hardwood, with an antique Persian rug centered in the room. Gabriel stood behind his ornate and rather large oak desk. "Do you like it?" He gestured to his library. "Very much," said Julia. "It's beautiful." She reached out to stroke the velvet of the red wingback, the mate to the chair she had admired by the fireplace, but she didn't think he'd like that. Professor Emerson was the sort to object to his things being handled, and so she stopped herself just in time. He'd probably snap at her for soiling it with her grubby little fingers. That's my favorite chair. It's quite comfortable, if you'd like to try it. Julia smiled as if he'd given her a present and eagerly sat in it, pulling in her legs under herself and curling up like a kitten. Gabriel could swear that he heard her purring. He smiled at the sight of her, momentarily relaxed and almost happy over such a trivial event. On a whim, he decided to show her one of his most valuable things. Here's something for you to see. He waved her over, and she came to stand in front of his desk. He opened a drawer and withdrew 2 sets of white cotton gloves. Put these on. He handed her a pair, which she accepted mutely, copying his movements as he pulled them over his long fingers. This is one of my most precious possessions, he explained, withdrawing a large wooden box from a now unlocked drawer. He placed the box on his desk, and for one horrible moment, Julia was afraid of what she might find inside. A shrunken head? Perhaps from a former graduate student. He opened the box and withdrew what looked like a book. When he opened it, it became evident that it was a series of stiff paper sleeves accordioned together, each labeled in Italian. He leafed through it and carefully until he found the sleeve he wanted. Then he removed something, cradling it in both hands. Julia gasped at the sight of it. Gabriel smiled with pride. Do you recognize it? Of course, but this can't be the original. He chuckled softly. Sadly, no. That would be beyond the reach of my small fortune. The originals date from the 15th century. These are reproductions from the 16th century. He held in his hand a copy of a famous illustration of Dante and Beatrice and the fixed stars of paradise, the original having been drawn in pen and ink by Sandro Botticelli. The illustration was about 15 inches by 20 inches, and even though it was only ink on parchment, the detail was breathtaking. How did you get this? I didn't even know there were any copies. Not only are they copies, they were probably done by a former student of Botticelli's, but this set is complete. Botticelli prepared 100 illustrations of the Divine Comedy, but only 92 of them survived. I have the full complement. Julia's eyes grew wide and round, shining in excitement. You're kidding. Gabriel laughed. No, I'm not. I went to see the originals when they were on loan to the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. The Vatican has 8, I think, and the rest are owned by a museum in Berlin. Quite. I thought you'd appreciate them. But I've never seen the remaining 8. No one has. Let me show you. Time flew as Gabriel showed Julia his treasures, and she was very quiet in her admiration until Rachel's voice called to them from the hall. Gabriel, get Julia a drink, would you, and stop boring her with your antique crap. He rolled his eyes and Julia giggled. How did you get them? Why aren't they in a museum? She asked as she watched him store his illustrations on their respective sleeves. He pressed his lips together. They aren't in a museum because I refuse to give them up, and no one knows I have them but my lawyer, my insurance agent, and now you. He set his jaw as if he was shutting down all further discussion, so Julia decided not to press him. It was probable that the illustrations had been stolen from a museum and that Gabriel had purchased them on the black market. That would explain his reticence in revealing their existence to the world. Julia shivered when she realized that she had seen what less than half a dozen people in the world had seen, and they were so breathtakingly beautiful, a true masterpiece. Gabriel! Rachel stood in the doorway, scolding him. Fine, fine. What would you like to drink, Miss Mitchell? They exited the study, and he walked to the wine refrigerator in the kitchen. Gabriel? Julianne? She started at the unfamiliar name as it dropped from his lips. Rachel noticed her strange reaction and disappeared into a cabinet, searching for her brother's pots and pans. Anything would be fine. Thank you, Prof. Gabriel. Julia closed her eyes at the pleasure of finally being able to pronounce his name to him. Then she settled herself on one of the elegant stools at the breakfast bar. Gabriel removed a bottle of Chianti and set it on the counter. "I'll let it come up to room temperature," he explained to no one in particular. He excused himself and disappeared, presumably to change into some more casual clothes. "Julia," Rachel hissed, putting a pile of vegetables into one side of the double sink. "What's going on with you and Gabriel?" "You need to ask him that." "I plan on it. But why is he acting so weird? And why didn't you just tell him who you were?" Julia looked as if she was about to burst into tears. "I thought he'd remember me, but he doesn't." Her voice shook as she looked down into her lap. Rachel was puzzled by her friend's words and by her overly emotional response and immediately flew to her side to press her into a hug. "Don't you worry. I'm here now and I'll straighten him out. He has a heart somewhere underneath everything else. I know. I saw it once. Now, help me wash some vegetables. The lamb is already in the oven." When Gabriel returned, he eagerly opened the wine, smiling to himself wickedly. He was in for a treat, and he knew it. He knew how Julianne looked when she tasted wine, and now he would have a repeat of her erotic performance from the other night. He felt himself twitch more than once in anticipation, and wished that he had a video camera secretly placed in his condo somewhere. It would probably be too obvious to pull his camera out and take snapshots of her. He showed her the bottle first, noting with approval the impressed expression that passed across her face when she read the label. He'd brought this special vintage back from Tuscany, and it would have pained him to waste it on an undiscerning palate. He poured a little into her glass and stood back, watching and trying very hard not to grin. Just as before, Julia swirled the wine slowly. She examined it in the halogen light. She closed her eyes and sniffed. Then she wrapped her kissable lips around the rim of the goblet and tasted it slowly, holding the wine in her mouth for a moment or two before swallowing. Gabriel sighed, watching her as the wine traveled down her long and elegant throat. When Julia opened her eyes, she saw Gabriel swaying slightly in front of her. His blue eyes darkened, his breath somewhat affected, and the front of his charcoal gray trousers. She frowned at him. Hard. "Are you all right?" He passed a hand over his eyes and willed himself into submission. "Yes, sorry." He poured a large glass for her and one for himself and began to sip it sensuously, watching her intently over the rim of his glass. "You're probably starving, Gabriel. I know what a beast you turn into when you're hungry." Rachel spoke over her shoulder as she stirred some kind of sauce on the stove. "What are we having with the lamb?" He was watching Julia like a hawk as she brought her wine glass up to her luscious mouth once again and took a large swallow. Rachel placed a box on the breakfast bar. "Couscous!" Julia spat out her wine, drenching Gabriel and his white shirt. In shock at her sudden expectoration, she dropped the wine glass, dousing herself and his hardwood floor in the process, the crystal goblet shattering on impact at the foot of her bar stool. Gabriel began shaking the wine droplets off of his expensive dress shirt and cursed loudly. Julia dropped to her knees and swiftly tried to pick up the scattered glass shards with her bare hands. "Stop," he said quietly, peering down at her over the edge of the breakfast bar. Julia continued her desperate mission, tears escaping her eyes. "Stop," he said more loudly, walking around the counter. She transferred some of the glass shards to her other hand and tried, picking up the remainder piece by piece, crawling on the floor pathetically like a wounded puppy that was dragging a broken paw. "Stop! For God's sake, woman, stop! You'll shred yourself to ribbons!" Gabriel towered menacingly, his anger descending on her from on high like the wrath of God. He pulled her to her feet by her shoulders and forced her to dump the glass from her hand into a bowl on the countertop, before guiding her down the hall and into the guest washroom. "Sit," he ordered. Julia sat on the top of the closed toilet and heaved a subdued but shuddering sob. "Hold out your hands." Her hands were stained with red wine and some small trickles of blood. A few crystals of glass sparkled on her palm against the cuts. Gabriel cursed a few times and shook his head as he opened his medicine cabinet. "You don't listen very well, do you?" Julia blinked at her tears, sorry that she couldn't wipe them away with her hands. "And you don't do what you're told." He looked over at her and abruptly stopped. He didn't know why he stopped, and if you had asked him why afterward, he would have shrugged and given you no explanation. But once he stopped what he was doing and saw the poor little creature that was huddled in a corner crying, he felt something. Something other than annoyance or anger or guilt or sexual arousal. He felt compassion for her, and he felt sorry that he had made her cry. He leaned over and began to wipe her tears away very tenderly with his fingertips. He noticed the hum that came from her mouth as soon as he touched her, and he noticed once again that her skin felt very familiar. And when he'd wiped away her tears, he cupped her pale face in his hands, tilting her chin upward, then retreated quickly and began cleaning her wounds. "Thank you," she murmured, noting the care with which he removed the glass from her hands. He used tweezers, meticulously searching out even the smallest fragments from her skin. "Don't mention it." When all the glass had been removed, he poured iodine onto some cotton balls. "This is going to sting." He watched as he steeled herself for his touch, and he winced slightly. He did not relish the thought of hurting her, and she was so soft and so fragile. It took him a full minute and a half to work up the courage to put the iodine on her cuts, and all the time she was sitting there, wide-eyed and biting her lip, waiting for him to just do it already. "There," he said gruffly as he wiped away the last of the blood. "You're all better." "I'm sorry I broke your glass. I know it was crystal." Her soft voice interrupted his reverie as he returned his first aid implements to the medicine cabinet. He waved a hand at her. "I have dozens. There's a crystal shop downstairs. I'll pick up another if I need it." "I'd like to replace it." "You couldn't afford it." The words escaped his mouth without him even realizing it. He watched in horror as Julia's face first reddened and then grew pale. Her head went down, of course, and she started chewing at the inside of her cheek. "Miss Mitchell, I wouldn't dream of taking your money. It would violate the rules of hospitality." "And we couldn't have that," thought Julia. "But I've stained your shirt. Please let me pay for the dry cleaning." Gabriel stared down at his lovely but obviously ruined white shirt and cursed inside his head. He'd liked this shirt. Paulina had bought it for him in London. And there was no way Julia's spittle mingled with the Chianti would ever come out. "I have several of these as well," he lied smoothly. "And I'm sure the stains will come out. Rachel will help me." Julia raked her upper teeth across her lower lip back and forth and back and forth. Gabriel saw the movement, and it made him rather queasy, like a kind of seasickness, but her lips were so red and inviting he couldn't look away. It was a bit like watching a car wreck while standing on the deck of a ship. He leaned over and patted the back of her hand. "Accidents happen. They're no one's fault." He smiled and was rewarded with a very pretty smile in return as she released her lower lip. "Look at her. She does blossom under kindness, just like a rose opening her petals." "Is she all right?" Rachel asked, suddenly appearing beside them. Gabriel withdrew his hand quickly and sighed. "Yes, but apparently Julianne hates couscous." He winked at her slyly and watched as the flush spread from her cheeks and over the surface of her porcelain skin. She truly was a brown-eyed angel. "That's fine, I'll make rice pilaf instead." Rachel disappeared and Gabriel followed, leaving Julia to stop her heart from trying to escape out of her chest. While Rachel packed away the disdained grains into the refrigerator, Gabriel went to his bedroom and changed his soiled shirt, depositing it with more than a little regret into the garbage. Then he joined his sister in the kitchen to clean up the broken glass and wine from the floor. "There are a couple of things I need to tell you about Julia," she began, speaking over her shoulder. Gabriel walked the glass shards to the garbage bin. "I'd rather not hear it." "What's wrong with you? She's my friend, for crying out loud." "And she's my student. I shouldn't know anything about her personal life. Her friendship with you already presents a conflict of interest that I was unaware of." Rachel squared her shoulders and shook her head stubbornly, her gray eyes darkening. "You know what? I don't care. I love her a lot, and Mom did too. So you remember that the next time you're tempted to shout at her. She's been broken, you jackass. That's why she hasn't kept in touch with me this past year. And now she's finally crawled out of her shell. A shell, I might add, that I thought she would never leave. And you're forcing her back into it with your arrogance and condescension. So drop the Mr. Rochester, Mr. Darcy, Heathcliff, British, stuck-uppity bullshit and treat her like the treasure she is, or I'm coming back here and putting a pump in your ass. Gabriel straightened his spine and cast her a withering stare. By pump, I take it you're referring to a lady's shoe? She didn't back down, or flinch. In fact, she grew taller and almost menacing. Fine, Rachel. Good. It's hard for me to believe that you didn't recognize her name after all the times I told you about how much she loved Dante. I mean, how many Dante enthusiasts from Selland's Grove do you know? He leaned over to her and placed a kiss across her furrowed brow. Go easy on me, Rach. I try not to think about anything connected with Selland's Grove if I can help it. Her anger melted at his words, and she hugged her brother tightly. I know. A few hours and another bottle of expensive Chianti later, Julia stood up to leave. Thanks for dinner. I should be getting home. We'll drive you, Rachel volunteered, disappearing to find her coat. Gabriel frowned and excused himself to go after her. It's all right, I can walk. It's not far, Julia called to the siblings. No way, it's dark out and I don't care how safe Toronto is. Besides, it's raining, Rachel shouted before finding herself engaged in a heated discussion with Gabriel. Julia walked toward the door so she wouldn't have to hear him say that he didn't want to drive her home. But the siblings reappeared shortly, and the three of them walked down the hall to the elevator. Just as the elevator was arriving, Rachel's cell phone rang. It's Aaron! She hugged Julia tightly. I've been trying to get a hold of him all day and he's been in meetings. Let's go to lunch. No need to worry, big brother. I have your spare key. Rachel strolled back to the apartment, leaving a scowling Gabriel and an uncomfortable Julia to take the elevator down to the garage. Were you ever going to tell me who you are? His voice was slightly accusing. Julia shook her head and hugged her ridiculous knapsack more tightly. He looked at her book bag and decided that it had to go. If he had to see that hideous thing one more time, he was going to lose it. And Paul had touched it, which meant that it was polluted. She'd have to throw it away. Gabriel led her to his parking space, and she immediately walked to the passenger side of the Jaguar. He pressed a button and the Range Rover next to the Jaguar chirped. Let's take this one instead. The four-wheel drive is better in the rain. I don't like taking the Jaguar out in weather like this if I don't have to. Julia tried to hide her look of surprise at Gabriel's embarrassment of riches, especially when he opened her door and helped her in. As she settled herself in her seat, she wondered if he'd felt the connection that had passed between them when he touched her arm. Of course he had. You let me make an ass out of myself, he scowled as he drove out of the garage. You did that all by yourself, thank you, Julia's unspoken thought shimmered between them, and she briefly wondered how good the professor was at reading nonverbal cues. I would have treated you differently. I would have treated you better if I'd known. Would you, really? And found some other student to rip apart? If that's the case, I'm glad your anger was directed at me. Then you couldn't take it out on anyone else. Gabriel gave her a cold look. This doesn't change anything. I'm glad you're Rachel's friend, but you're still my student, which means we need to be professional, Miss Mitchell. And you will be careful how you speak to me now and in the future. Yes, Professor Emerson. He searched her face for any sign of sarcasm, but saw none. Her shoulders were hunched and her head was down. He'd made his little rose wither. Any blossoming had now been completely undone. Your little rose? What the hell, Emerson? Rachel is very glad you're here. Did you know that she was engaged? Julia shook her head. Was? Not anymore? Aaron Webster asked her to marry him, and she said yes, but that was before Grace. He exhaled slowly. Rachel doesn't feel like planning a wedding now, so she's called it off. That's why she's here. Oh, no. I'm so sorry. Poor Rachel, she exhaled slowly. Poor Aaron. I loved him. Gabriel frowned. They're still together. Aaron loves her, obviously, and he agreed she needed some time away. There was a lot of fighting at my parents' house when I was home. She came to see me to get away, which is laughable, really, since I'm the black sheep of the family and she's the favorite. Julia nodded as if she understood. I have a problem with anger, Miss Mitchell. I have a bad temper. I have trouble controlling it, and when I lose my temper, I can be very destructive. Her eyes widened at his declaration, and her mouth opened slightly, but she did not speak. It would be inadvisable for me to lose my temper around someone like you. It would be very damaging for both of us. His declaration was so honest and so frightening. The words burned into her like fire. Wrath is one of the 7 deadly sins, she remarked, turning away from him to gaze out of the window, trying to alleviate the burning sensation in her middle. He laughed bitterly. Remarkably, I have all 7. Don't bother counting. Pride, envy, wrath, sloth, avarice, gluttony, lust. She lifted an eyebrow but did not turn around. Somehow, I doubt that. I don't expect you to understand. You're only a magnet for mishap, Miss Mitchell, while I am a magnet for sin. Now she turned to face him. He smiled at her with a look of resignation, and she offered him a sympathetic look in return. Sin isn't something that is attracted to a human being, Professor. It's the other way around. Not in my experience. Sin seems to find me even when I'm not looking for it, and I'm not very good at resisting temptation. He glanced at her, then returned his eyes to the road. Your friendship with Rachel explains why you sent gardenias, and why you signed the card the way you did. I'm sorry about Grace. I loved her too. He looked into her eyes. They were kind and open, yet he saw traces of sadness and incalculable loss. I realize that now, he admitted. You have satellite radio? She gestured to the console as he switched on the radio and pressed one of the preset buttons. Yes, I usually listen to one of the jazz stations, but it depends on my mood. Julia reached out a tentative finger to the radio, but withdrew her hand. Gabriel smiled at her reticence, remembering the way she'd purred when he gave her permission to curl up in his favorite chair. He wanted to make her purr again. It's all right. You can choose something. She ran through the presets, smiling at his choices, which included the French CBC station and BBC News, until she came to the last one, which was labeled 9 Inch Nails. There's an entire station devoted to them? She sounded incredulous. Yes. Gabriel squirmed a little, as if she had uncovered an embarrassing secret. And you like them? When I'm in a particular mood. Julia pressed the button for the jazz station. Gabriel felt rather than observed her visceral reaction. He did not understand it, but decided not to probe it. Julia hated 9 Inch Nails. She changed the station whenever they came on the radio. If a song of theirs was playing somewhere, she left the room or the building. The sounds of their music, and especially Trent Reznor's voice, creeped her the hell out, although she never told anyone why. She first heard them in a club back in Philadelphia. She was dancing with him, and he was grinding all over her. She hadn't minded at first. That's how he was. But then that song came on, and as soon as the music began, Julia felt mildly ill. It was the strange sequence in the opening bars. Then it was the voice. Then it was the lyrics about fucking like an animal. And the look on his face as he brought his forehead to hers and whispered it to her, staring straight into her soul. Whatever Julia's religious beliefs and her half-hearted attempts to pray to lesser gods and deities, at that moment she'd believed that she had heard the voice of the devil. Lucifer himself held her in his arms and whispered to her. And the very idea, coupled with his words, frightened her. Julia had wrenched herself from him and fled to the ladies' washroom, looking at the pale and shaking girl in the mirror, wondering what the hell had just happened. She did not know why he had spoken to her like that, or why he had chosen that moment to confess. Nevertheless, she knew him well enough to know that the repeated lyric was a confession of his deepest and perhaps darkest intentions, and not just a mindless repetition. But Julia didn't want to be fucked like an animal. She wanted to be loved. She would have forsworn sex forever if she thought it would guarantee her the kind of love that was the stuff of poetry and myth. That was the kind of affection she craved desperately, but didn't actually believe that she deserved. She wanted to be someone's muse, to be worshipped and adored, body and soul. She wanted to play Beatrice to a dashing and noble Dante, and to inhabit paradise with him forever, and to live a life that would rival the beauty of Botticelli's illustrations. And that is why at the age of 23, Julia Mitchell was still a virgin, with the photograph of a man who ruined her for others tucked into the back of her underwear drawer. For the past 6 years she'd slept with his picture under her pillow. No man had ever come close to comparing to him. No feelings of affection had ever approximated the love and devotion he inspired in her. Their entire relationship was based on a single night, a night she relived in her memories over and over again. And we'll find out about that night on the next episode. One thing I could say about Sylvain Reynard, she's trying to be funny, but she keeps forgetting that the punchline goes at the end of the joke, not in the middle. She keeps stepping on her own humor. I'm going to be honest with you guys. I think this book is almost good. I hope it gets better. It's not 50 Shades. I love the 50 Shades books. I'm having a little trouble getting into this one, to be honest with you. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's interesting. And I'm finding as I go, it's getting a little bit better. It's still not got me yet. What are your thoughts on it? What are your thoughts on how all this goes? Please let me know down in the comments below. Let me know your favorite parts. Let me know your least favorite parts. Let me know anything. Now remember, you want me to start doing 2 of these videos a week, you gotta help me get to 50 likes on this video. 50 likes. This was dropping on Wednesday. By next Wednesday, this video needs to have 50 likes, and I will guarantee you 2 videos a week from here on out, come hell or high water. If I have to record them on my cell phone in the car, I'll do it. I give you my guarantee. So, until the next time, I'm Couch Potato Mike reminding you that in the end we're all stories. So let's make them good ones. See you next time, guys.